Good afternoon, Tobias. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Well, it's great to get the chance to talk to you. I've just finished reading your book, Avoiding the Worst, and it was a fascinating and compelling piece of work. So it's great to get the chance to talk to you to understand, I guess, the philosophy that underpins that and the imperative that you lay out so clearly in the book. So thanks for joining me on Sentientism. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And the themes of your work, I think, fit really nicely into what I'm trying to do here, because I'm trying to answer in this series, I guess, what I think of as the most important and deepest philosophical questions, the questions of, what's real and how should we understand a reality in the universe we all share, but just as importantly, the deep questions of ethics and what do good and bad and right and wrong even mean, and critically, who gets to count as we're trying to make the world a better place. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize sentientism as a really pluralistic, broad baseline worldview that suggests when it comes to epistemology and what's real, we should use evidence and reason and a broadly naturalistic approach, hopefully with a healthy dash of humility to try and understand reality as far as we're able to. And when it comes to the ethical scope question, the clue is in the name, that every sentient being, any being with the capacity to have experiences, particularly valenced experiences, should matter as we're working out what to do. So I summarize that as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But I'm talking in this series of conversations with a really broad variety of fascinating minds, some of whom may agree with that worldview and some who don't. So it'll be interesting to explore your own thinking and how your work fits into those themes too. But before I get onto those big philosophical questions, how would you best introduce yourself? And do you also want to give us a quick sort of introduction to Avoiding the Worst and what it's about?
So my name is Tobias. I'm a researcher at and co-founder of the Center for Reducing Suffering. And so the Center for Reducing Suffering is a nonprofit and a research organization which is aiming to, broadly speaking, answer the question of how can we best reduce suffering. And I'm also the author of the book Avoiding the Worst, which is exploring the idea called S-risks, which refers to worst-case future outcomes with a very high amount of suffering, and explores how those could come about and how they could be prevented. So I suppose we're going to go into all this in more detail in this conversation.
Absolutely. And the way you laid out the S-risk imperative and I guess a sort of call to action in the book echoes the structure we use in these conversations quite well. Because, for example, when you're talking about how politics should operate, you talk about a two-step approach that first has us operating almost as moral philosophers and thinking about who should matter and what should matter, and then thinking about an empirical approach, which is, okay, now we've worked out what matters, we need to understand reality so that we can engage in it in a hopefully a constructive way. And I sort of take these the other way around, really. So our first question is the second one of those, which is about what's real in epistemology. And again, I'm not going to drag you through your own personal story here because we're going to set the conversation very much in the context of S-risks in your work. But it'd be interesting, very briefly, to understand your own epistemological journey. So for many of my guests, it was a story about whether they grew up originally in maybe a more spiritual, religious, or a supernaturally minded family and context, social context, or one that was maybe quite scientific and naturalistic, maybe atheistic, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, if it has, and how do you think about epistemology now? And then I'd love to understand how epistemology is important in the S-risks context.
Yeah, so I think my upbringing is relatively unremarkable. It's not overly religious, and I myself would probably have said that I'm an atheist since I'm old enough to think about these issues.
So there wasn't a big transition for you or a shift there yet?
No, not so much. No. I mean, this has never been such an important question to me personally, the issue of religion. But I think it is fair to say that I have a naturalistic worldview, and that my answer to what's real is basically what we can scientifically observe and measure and so on. So that's something that I'm pretty settled on.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I find it interesting because in many people who work in these sort of related fields, there's often just such a deep assumption that, of course we have a naturalistic worldview, that people sometimes forget to, I think, engage with it and reinforce how important naturalism is. And, we were swapping emails before and sort of discussing how we're going to approach this conversation. And I made the slightly silly point that, there are billions of people around the world who think the biggest possible S risk is that of being sent to hell by a supposedly benevolent God. So even in the space of S risks and, trying to make these engagements, I think it's, personally, I think it's really important not to just assume naturalism. We need to remember that most of the world, at least in part, doesn't actually have naturalistic epistemology in the first place. But it's clear that your personal journey is quite straightforward on that side. So,
yeah, that seems right.
I start with that sort of religion and supernatural question just because it's so societally resonant, and often it's quite an important journey for my guests. But that's not the only question in epistemology. Even if you have, a naturalistic epistemology and you don't necessarily, have a fideistic approach or a dogmatic approach or approach that's based on revelation, there's still plenty of space to have poor quality or broken epistemology even within a naturalistic worldview as well. And that comes through quite strongly in your work, because you do talk about some of the challenges that we're facing and the epistemological problems that might make those challenges harder. So as you work through that, I guess thinking about how to make the world better, or at least avoid some of the worst possible outcomes, what are some of the epistemological challenges you see that get in the way, whether those are biases or motivated reasoning or...
Yeah, I do have a chapter in my book on that is dedicated to the issue of cognitive biases, which is roughly speaking very common mistakes in our reasoning about, not just the issue of S risks, but everything basically. And one very important one is wishful thinking, to think that the world is the way we wish it to be, rather than looking objectively at what the world actually is like. So this is relevant for the issue of S risks because this is, of course, not exactly a pleasant dinner conversation to talk about worst case futures with very high levels of suffering. And so we would, of course, wish for S risks to not come about and not be a serious concern, but that should not bias us into actually thinking that. So we sort of need to correct for this bias. And another very common bias is, of course, confirmation bias, to view evidence in a distorted way, where you just look at whatever confirms your pre-existing ideas or prejudices and disregard all evidence that contradicts it. So those are just two of the many biases that we would need to keep in mind. Another one is perhaps scope neglect, which is that when we're talking about scenarios that affect very large numbers, as humans, we don't really have a good sense of those large numbers, right? So there are quite abstract ideas about optimizing for the expected value, how many individuals what one's actions affect, but we don't really feel that so much on an emotional level. It doesn't really feel so different to help one person compared to 5 or 10. And then if we're talking about a billion, then it just we don't really have an emotional yardstick for that. So that is one problem to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you. And it strikes me that as you talk through the different types of S risks and suffering risks, there are some that it's a little easier for us to get our heads around in the epistemological sense, because they are maybe things that are going on at the moment, like animal agriculture. They are things that are maybe nearer to us. They are things that are scales we're used to. But you also consider some S risks that are much further away from our day-to-day experience. You talk about the long-term future. You talk about scales that are difficult to understand. You talk about sometimes even types of beings that we might not be familiar with identifying with. I guess that presents a different level of epistemological challenge, because we're going further and further away from, I guess, the types of problems we evolved to deal with.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, technically, the way S risks are defined is that it is a worst case outcome with a level of suffering that would dwarf everything that existed so far. So, technically speaking, factory farming would not count as an S risk, although that is, of course, not to downplay it. I mean, I surely think that factory farming is a moral catastrophe of incredible scope.
So does that mean that before we'd started industrial animal agriculture, it would have been seen as an S risk, but now we're doing it, S risk has to go above that threshold? Is that how it's defined?
I mean, yeah, maybe.
Because in a way, it's a form of totalitarian value lock-in for non-human animals.
Yeah, I mean, maybe from the perspective of someone in the Middle Ages who does care about all sentient beings, from their perspective, maybe factory farming could be considered an S risk. But yeah, I mean, from our perspective, S risks would be things that would be like much larger scale, but still by perhaps many orders of magnitude. Yeah, which again is not to downplay the severity of factory farming.
One of the other biases you talked about, because in this series, I guess the center of gravity of our conversation is more about solving present problems, and those are within, problems of intrahuman discrimination and harm, absolutely problems of intraspecies, harm, and issues like farming and exploitation. So that tends to be where we spend most of our time talking. And the things you've talked about there, motivated reasoning, cognitive biases, are really powerful forces, because often it seems, yes, there are ethical failings when people do those things. There's just a decision not to care about some group, but very often there are actually epistemological errors that are underpinning those choices as well. So it might be, a mistaken belief that non-human animals can't suffer, or a belief that animal farming in some way could be humane or sustainable. These are factual errors. They're not necessarily ethical errors. So we're quite familiar with the sort of motivated reasoning and cognitive dissonance type stuff.
And then one more factual error, perhaps, that even many animal advocates make is to only look at factory farmed animals and to neglect the issue of animals that live in nature, of wild animal suffering. Because if you look at, the vast majority of sentient beings on Earth are not humans, of course, and also not factory farmed animals, but animals living in the wild, in nature. And they unfortunately also suffer very serious harms, ranging from predation to starvation to diseases. There are many resources, like, for instance, Animal Ethics has a video course on this issue for anyone who is interested in that. And this is I think, a very important issue, because the scope of it is actually perhaps larger still than factory farming. So arguably the most important, assuming that one cares about wild animal suffering, that this might be the most important source of suffering at this point in time. Although, as you've mentioned, we will be talking about future scenarios as well that might be larger still than the amount of wild animal suffering that exists right now.
Absolutely. And we'll come back to that and dig into that when we talk about who matters. And before we move on to that, there was one specific type of epistemological challenge that S risks present that I haven't really talked about too much here, which is the one of belief digitization, I think is the phrase you used. And I guess the way I'd introduce it is to say that with some of the S risks you're talking about, the suffering risks you're talking about things that could be genuinely, incomprehensibly, catastrophically bad in their impact, but maybe have quite a small probability of occurring. As I understand it, belief digitization is this sort of tendency to, if something's low probability, to just crush it to zero, in the same way as if something's quite likely, we might push it up to 1. So how does belief digitization play into your work, and how much of a problem is that when you're thinking about low probability, high impact, maybe distant future outcomes?
Yeah. It is a challenge to generally deal with the enormous uncertainty that we have about what will happen in the future, and how S risks could come about. And belief digitization, as you were saying, is the tendency that people might have to say, like, either, I believe this or I do not believe it, as I sort of round the probability down to 0 or 1. But if it is true that we should actually be reasoning in an expected value framework, then of course something that is quite unlikely but is very large in terms of its scope, in terms of the number of beings affected, can still be a very high priority. And that can be it can be quite difficult for people to reason in this probabilistic fashion, because it's not necessarily what we are emotionally, made for, so to speak.
Yeah. And the approach you lay out in the book is, or the one you suggest is a good default, is to use expected value as an approach. And as you said,
this is of course also not entirely without its problems, because if you're talking about scenarios that are extremely unlikely, but have extremely large scopes, then this has been called Pascal's mugging in online discourse, then it can feel a bit absurd to care about such extremely far-fetched scenarios just because you're supposedly talking about an extremely large number of beings that this can also, but there's that complication too. And I think there's a balance to be struck between taking speculative scenarios sufficiently seriously, but not getting crazy over it either. So there is a balance to be struck there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you want to briefly explain what Pascal's mugging is and how that might play out, just for people who aren't familiar with the term?
The story goes that someone is coming up to you on the street and tells you that they have this parallel universe in which 10 to the power 50 beings are suffering, and the person offers to you that if you give them $5, then they are able to, through their magical powers, to help all those beings and to stop them from suffering. Yeah, and so the question is, do you give them your $5? Now, of course, it would seem extremely unlikely that this is actually true, because the story is obviously quite absurd. But then the argument goes is that, okay, even if it's only a dip, there's just like a 1 in a trillion chance that this is actually true, then, in expectation, it's still worthwhile to give them your money.
Because if we're good sort of Bayesians or rationalists, you still don't never give it zero probability. So there's always some chance, right? Yeah. No, that's useful. So on the one hand, if you think about me as the average human, you're trying to push me hard to take, lower probability, particularly serious impacts more seriously, and not to oversimplify, but you don't want to push me too far that I get into a Pascal's mugging situation. There is an intuitive balance there somewhere.
I would emphasize that I would not think of asterisks as a Pascal's mugging. Maybe some specific scenarios will be very far-fetched, but the broader idea of a large-scale moral catastrophe in the future doesn't seem that far-fetched to me at all, and it doesn't seem extremely unlikely. It seems sufficiently likely to be worth taking seriously. That's what I would argue. And one argument to make for that, which is quite straightforward and that you've already mentioned, is that we already have a similar dynamic to that in terms of factory farming. So, why is it so crazy to suppose that something similar but on an even larger scale could happen in the future?
It's already happened before, and in some cases we've done it before.
So it's not a Pascal's mugging because it's not that absurd and not that unlikely. We can discuss more about how high is the likelihood actually, but it certainly does seem sufficiently likely to me to be worth thinking about, especially since the topic is quite neglected. I'm just a random guy on the internet and I've managed to write the first book on this topic. It would seem that the possibility of worst case futures with astronomical levels of suffering is worth, having one book on,
You would think, yeah. But you make a really important point there, that these asterisks we're talking about, fine, some of them might seem very unlikely and might seem somewhat far-fetched, a bit of sci-fi, but some of them are actually pretty high probability and pretty significant. The evidence you talked about there is a great example, but there's plenty within even the intrahuman species as well. You could look at, the rise of fascism in the 20th century or other examples, and they may not be quite on the scale that you're considering or the severity you're considering, because you're talking about some pretty brutal scenarios, but there are at least indications that genuinely deeply horrific things and widespread suffering can come to bear for a variety of reasons.
Certainly. And if you envision a future in which there is more advanced technology of some sort, possibly humanity could spread to other planets or advanced artificial intelligence or the like, if you expect that, then humanity will have ever more powerful tools at its disposal. And if we don't make moral progress, and the world, for instance, our treatment of animals remains as horrible as it is now, then it's not so difficult to see how the combination of those two facts can lead to an S-risk.
Agree. So let's move on to the second question, which is this, I guess, what matters question. And we'll come on to who matters in a minute. And you've hinted at your answer already, because the focus of your work is essentially about mitigating the most serious, worst case risks of suffering. So it's clear that suffering is something that matters deeply to you. What more would you say to that question? Because there are some people who will say, they will follow a divine command theory where ultimately what matters is really doing God's will, for example. There are other people who will take a nihilistic approach and say, in a sense, nothing really matters. Others might take a moral relativistic approach that says it's really just descriptively how different groups agree sets of norms amongst themselves. And who are we to judge from outside whether those are good or bad? They're just groups will define morals and off they go. And then there's a bunch of other, normative moral philosophies that we might pick from, that might be a virtue ethic or a feminist care ethic or a relational ethic or a deontological ethic or a utilitarian. Or how do you think about, the foundations of right and wrong and good and bad, if such things exist?
Yeah, so it would seem to me that generally the idea that we should try to prevent the suffering of others and to help those who are suffering harms, that seems relatively uncontroversial, right?
You would think. Okay. You can find philosophers who will say, yes, but is suffering really bad?
When we're talking about very serious forms of suffering, like being eaten alive or burning to death or something like that, then I think you're right. There are philosophers who say that. I disagree with those philosophers. That's basically all that I would say to that.
I totally agree with you that, wanting not to cause suffering or to avoid suffering seems a sort of quite deep imperative that should apply across lots of different moral systems. Is it the only thing that matters to you? Because in a way, suffering is about, the momentary experience of a sentient experiencing being. But others will criticize that and say, well, that definitely matters because it matters to that being. That being doesn't like suffering, and that's why it is a bad thing intrinsically. But they will also say, well, look, there's some other stuff we should also care about. We should care about, interests and preferences and life intrinsically, dignity, agency. Are there other things you'd add context, or is it very much about suffering for you?
I would not necessarily say that all these other things are nonsensical or that it doesn't matter at all, but it just seems that, especially when we're talking about severe forms of suffering, that many of those other things feel relatively abstract and perhaps less important in comparison to that, especially when we're talking about worst case scenarios with like very large amounts of possibly severe suffering. Then compared to that, some of those other things just don't seem on quite the same scale of importance or urgency to me. That's perhaps what I would say about that.
Thank you. And what do you think about the flip side? The idea of positive valent experiences and flourishing and pleasure and enjoyment and love and joy. I guess one, are those important to you? Or are you only concerned about suffering? And how do you think that the two balance off? And is it possible to even think about balancing and measuring and weighing these things, or is it a tougher challenge than that?
Yeah, this raises a lot of very complex questions in the field of population ethics. And there's what's called suffering-focused ethics, which is the view that suffering is what should be our primary moral priority. And this is a view that I would broadly subscribe to. I would, for people who are interested in the philosophical side of that, I would recommend the book called Suffering-Focused Ethics by Magnus Winding, a colleague of mine at the Center for Reducing Suffering. And we also have lots of texts on our website that are going into more detail on these philosophical questions. So I would probably refer the reader to that for more details. But I do broadly subscribe to the view that suffering should be our primary, that reducing suffering should be our primary goal.
Yeah. So the good stuff counts, but the focus should be on reducing suffering. Is that a fair summary? You wouldn't put the positive stuff to zero. It's just in the context, suffering is the priority.
Yeah, the way I would maybe put it is that it doesn't seem to me to be morally urgent to create more happy beings, for instance, or to like maximize the intensity of happiness of someone who's already well off. That just doesn't seem like a moral priority compared to alleviating suffering of people who are worse off. I appreciate that, people can have very different intuitions on that. I'm not saying that, I'm right and everyone else is wrong. It boils down to fundamental intuitions that people have, and those are just the intuitions that I tend to have, that many people tend to have. And that's basically where I'm coming from.
Thank you. And even the people who, do take a strong focus on flourishing and enhancing flourishing, and maybe as part of that, feel an imperative to create new positive lives, which, as you've hinted, can have some pretty problematic policy implications if you take it seriously. Even those people would still agree with you that suffering is a bad thing and we should work to mitigate the risks of catastrophic suffering, right? So again, there's this idea that, fine, we might disagree on some stuff, but this should be a pretty solid core we can all agree on, is that suffering is bad. And yeah.
It should be like very uncontroversial, sort of the thing that everyone should be able to get behind, that those worst case outcomes are worth preventing.
Yeah, you would think. And I've had this conversation with some of the people who talk about, is suffering intrinsically bad? And there are also other philosophers whose philosophy of mind leads them to say that actually consciousness itself might be an illusion or may not even exist. But even then, if I stick this pen in the back of their hand, it's going to hurt and they're not going to like it. So, you can philosophize as much as you like. Whether that pain is illusory or not ultimately doesn't matter to you. It still hurts. So, I think there's a common ground there, hopefully.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I can sort of see where like the nihilist faction might be coming from, that, nothing really matters. But it's also a bit unsatisfactory. You see, you need to do something in life. And being nihilist doesn't really help you with that either. So why not care about reducing the suffering of others?
Exactly. Even if it's just a choice, it seems like a good one to me. So let's go for it. Yeah. Well, that's brilliant. Thank you. So let's come on to this who matters question. And again, I'm interested in your journey here, because in our current society, this often is a really difficult social and psychological journey for people to make, because the default human cultures around the world, most of them are, one, very anthropocentric, and two, quite often discriminatory, even within intrahuman groups as well. So the typical child might come into the world with a sort of fairly open-minded compassion for any being they encounter. But, the enculturation talks about family, friends, maybe a wider group than that, maybe a nation, maybe a type of people that look like me. And then if we're lucky, some sort of aspiration to universal human rights, and a few carefully selected non-humans might be lucky enough to be included in our moral scope as well. But so again, I don't want to drag you through a personal history, but what was your journey to where you are now, which, as I understand it, is absolutely about a very broad range of beings?
Yeah. So with regards to caring about animals, I think I came across arguments for that on the internet, and then went vegetarian at the age of like 17 or 18 or something like that. I read Peter Singer at some point, his argument for anti-speciesism, and I found that convincing. Then, of course, beyond the issue of farmed animals, there's the topic of wild animal suffering, which I've already mentioned. And for a long time, that was just never on my mind, and not something that even had crossed my mind. And until I read about it on the internet, but I was fairly quickly convinced by that, actually, despite the fact that it might seem counterintuitive to many people, that we should care about animals living in nature. Like, to me, it didn't seem counterintuitive, like, given that I was already convinced of anti-speciesism. I mean, why would animals living in nature be less important than those living on factory farms or as pets, dogs or cats in human society? That would all seem like basically the core argument in all of those cases is that those distinctions are fairly arbitrary, ultimately, just as arbitrary as to say that, only people of my my nationality or my ethnic group matter and everyone else doesn't. Or even to say that only I and my family and friends matter, and the rest doesn't matter. I mean, you can say that if that's your point of view, fine. But like, I just think like on a philosophical level, I don't find it particularly satisfactory. Like, I mean, why would that be the case? From an impartial point of view, it would seem that all suffering, all sentient beings should matter equally. It would seem that way.
Yeah. And it seems, because I was lucky to interview Peter a few episodes ago, so we explored his journey in that focus on anti-speciesism. And there are some people who are, and I think Peter is one of them, whose approach to this is it's somewhat technical and it's somewhat intellectual. So it's a sense of, this species classification and the categories that flow from those are arbitrary. It doesn't make sense. They don't seem well-founded, so we should ignore them. And it's more of a technical journey that people take. And that can lead to also thinking about injustice. And justice is a question of fairness. And those are stances I think you can achieve, even if you don't feel an emotional attachment or necessarily a compassion for the beings involved. It can just be this just doesn't logically make sense to me. And then there's a different path, and there's loads more paths. There's a different path, which is more about, empathy and sympathy and compassion for an individual being, whether it's a human or a non-human. And that's another path where people can go, right, other humans, they can look at the puppy at my feet, who might join the interview later. They can think about a farmed animal, but then they can think about a wild animal. And again, I imagine what it would be like to be them. And that visceral sense of identification is a more emotional way into it. Which was it for you, or is it a mix?
I mean, I suppose ideally it should be a sort of combination of the two, right? I mean, there has to be this emotional core of empathizing and compassion with others. Because if you don't have this at all, then you might as well say, like, well, why care about anything? But assuming that you do have that, then it also requires the intellectual side to understand that this goes far beyond only the beings that you would normally, so to speak, care about, which is your immediate surroundings. You need the intellectual side to understand that it should apply to all sentient beings. And of course, one can take this much further than even farmed animals and wild animals. For instance, at some point I also came across the issue of invertebrates, such as insects, and whether or not they might also be sentient. And I mean, I don't want to pretend that I emotionally care about fruit flies. I mean, I'm not sure if anyone really does, but on this abstract level, I mean, the argument for taking invertebrates or insects seriously and their potential suffering is that while it is uncertain that they are sentient, there is maybe some chance. I mean, we can't confidently rule that out. And if they are, then there is a very large number of insects or like ants or whatever it is. And that's why this could be a quite important issue, actually.
And it's interesting the way you put that, because I think quite often when people are talking about speciesism and anti-speciesism, there's an often unstated assumption that what we're actually talking about is a positive stance that grants moral consideration for every sentient being. And you can see that unstated assumption is there because people don't normally complain about speciesism against the species of a plant. We don't think that's a problematic sort of speciesism because there's an assumption that the plant isn't sentient. So actually the anti-speciesism is resisting the speciesism of sentient beings. It's not resisting all forms of speciesism. Although even the rejection of the speciesism against a plant it's not about the species, it's about the lack of sentience. But it seems like sentience is an underpinning thing there, even if it's not called out.
Yeah, this is why sentience would seem to be a logical and coherent criterion, right? I've never met anyone who says that they care about plants.
I've met a few, but then that's what being a vocal vegan on Twitter gets you. You'll find a dazzling array of...
You could, of course, say that even if it's unlikely that the plants are sentient, there are so many of them, perhaps.
Yeah, and but there is also a...
this, I think, is where we're getting into the Pascal's nugget.
We may well be, but of course, one of the ways that my sort of preferred, and I think your preferred stance of, I guess, a sentiocentrism is often criticized because people will say, look, you're not going far enough. And there are formal ethical scope arguments around biocentrism for all living things, even if they're not sentient. So that would include, plants and fungi, and an ecocentrism, which will go even beyond that and say, look, rocks, rivers, trees, ecosystems, the earth as Gaia should intrinsically matter morally. I don't know what your thought is about those types of challenges.
I don't really find the arguments for that very convincing, or I haven't heard something that would convince me to assign intrinsic value to something like rocks, trees, and rivers, apart from the value that those things might provide to beings living in this space.
I have a similar view that I think all of those things are really important too, but I think they're instrumentally important because of the sentient beings that live amongst them and are interdependent in them rather than directly. But yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned biocentrism, and so that, of course, raises the very important and interesting question of whether artificial entities could become sentient if you have sufficiently complex artificial intelligence or computer simulations or the like. Is it possible that they will become sentient at some point? This is, of course, actually, there has already been discussions around this Lambda affair at Google, where someone claimed that this language model would possess sentience. I don't really believe it in that case, but it does seem likely to me that, at least in principle, these forms of sentience could also be possible. And the argument would again be that while this is uncertain, it is possible that they could be created in large numbers in the future. And if that is so, that's quite possibly a very important factor for S-risks, because just look at how humanity treats animals, and then how do you think those artificial minds that might be completely powerless or not have any sort of voice to represent them, how would they be treated? There could be a complete lack of moral concern for such beings, or people might be mistaken about their sentience, or might not believe that they're sentient, just how people have claimed that animals aren't sentient for a very long time. So one can see how this is, if it is actually going to happen, that there will be a lot of artificially sentient entities, then that holds the potential for S-risks. Although I'm not, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this definitely is going to happen. And in fact, when people argue that it's possible to have artificial minds, this is perhaps also a little bit beside the point, because the question is whether is actually realistic that it will happen. It is possible in principle to build an underwater metropolis, but will it actually happen? So, and there's of course lots of complex philosophical questions around those issues, like what does consciousness even mean, and is it possible to have it in those digital substrates? But on balance, I do think that it's a concern worth taking seriously, that we could have artificial minds and that they could be mistreated on a large scale potentially, and that it's therefore important to keep this in mind.
So again, it's not, we're not doing the belief digitization thing where you're saying it is going to happen. You're saying it's in principle possible, it might happen.
Exactly. It might happen or it might not happen. As a general point, what do I know about what's going to happen in the future? I don't have a crystal ball. So we just need to deal with this uncertainty and to take into account many different scenarios. And then ideally find ways to act that are robustly good across many different scenarios. We might get into that later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the areas, one of the challenges around S-risk in terms of current social dynamics and political dynamics is you are often pushing people far away from their intuitions. And this one about moral scope is one of those. And it's a particularly interesting dynamic because, as you might expect, given I'm focusing on, naturalistic grounding and a sentiocentric moral concern, many of the people who identify with that way of thinking are very active in the animal advocacy movements and the vegan movements. And for those people, I think and I include myself amongst them, right? In a way, we're pushing humanity very hard and saying, look, we need to move away from this anthropocentrism. We need to move away from even the sort of intra-group human discrimination to caring about all humans. But then we need to break anthropocentrism and go out and genuinely take into account the companion animals, the animals in our labs that are exploited, maybe the liminal animals that live in and around us, but absolutely the farmed animals that we exploit and fish at a catastrophic scale. So on the one hand, those movements are really trying to, in a way, go your direction and push that moral scope hard in a deeply revolutionary way. But those movements are still very nervous about going beyond that. So I find that when I have these conversations with people within the sentientism groups, because as soon as you start talking about, as you mentioned already, wild animals, future individuals, and particularly if you talk about sentient AI, people all of a sudden then want to put the brakes on and like, look, we've got so much of a problem here with breaking humanity's anthropocentrism. Isn't that going too far? So I find it really interesting. We're trying to push out, but at the same time, put the brakes on really quickly.
Yeah. I mean, the issue of whether future beings matter is another point that we haven't quite discussed it and can go into more detail. And you're, of course, raising what I would perhaps consider to be a strategic question for the animal advocacy movement. Like, even granting that all those sentient beings matter, it might not be a smart strategic approach to try to move people all the way to that. And it might be better to focus now on the first step of getting people to care about farmed animals. It might be. But this is different from saying that only farmed animals matter. This is just a strategic point, a strategic question.
And I think that's such an important distinction to make, because one thing I do find, whether it's, and I've had some fascinating conversations about the wild animal topic, so that's a great example, but it absolutely applies in the sentient AI space, and arguably for future beings too, is sometimes people will take a strategic or even a tactical concern about where we should focus, and will use that to then withdraw moral consideration from vast swathes of other sentient or potentially sentient beings. And my appeal to them is, as you've hinted that there, right? Fine, your strategy or your tactics might well be to focus and prioritize, but that's not an excuse to withdraw a moral consideration from these other sentient beings. So even if it comes to wild animal suffering, even if you're deeply skeptical of the human hubris of intervention, even if you're deeply uncertain about whether and what we could do about wild animal suffering, even if you're very nervous that there are rich patterns of operation in biological nature we don't understand and terrible things could happen if we try and intervene, even with the best motivations at heart, even if you believe all of that stuff, and I empathize with much of it, that's still not a reason to withdraw our moral consideration from any of those individual sentient beings living free-ranging in the wild. So let's make a distinction between, as you said in your book, this sort of two-step process where first you set the moral scope and you work out who's included, but you don't let that become narrowed or perverted by tactical or strategic considerations.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, all those considerations don't change anything about the fact that the wild animals exist and that they do matter. I agree with that.
Yeah. And do you think, again, this leads into it really, but in a way your work, I think, is aspiring to a sort of pure and perfect impartiality that disregards species, even disregards substrates, even disregards time, and says that even far future beings that are very different from us should still matter in a very serious way. It's quite a pure. Is there any space for a more graded, prioritized stance that, or is that, again, is that just a strategic question? Is it?
I mean, people can, of course, have a mixed moral view where, like, they're giving some weight to all those things, but maybe still say that they care more about friends and family. And, like, I mean, you're saying that I'm aspiring to that impartial view. I wouldn't seriously try to pretend that I'm actually indifferent between my own well-being and that of, a randomly selected wild animal. I mean, I don't think I can reasonably pretend that. But I still think that on this theoretical, philosophical level, it's the right aspiration to have.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so you've mentioned the issue of future beings and thinking long term. This may be a similar point to be made there, that on the abstract level, I would fairly strongly defend the view that future beings matter equally. Like, I mean, why would the suffering of someone in the year 2500 matter more or less than the suffering of someone in the year 2000? This doesn't really, on a philosophical level, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But then that needs to be distinguished from practical objections. Like, people are often making the argument, and I think there is something to that the future is, of course, very difficult to predict. And so it might be more difficult to do something to help prevent suffering in the year 2500 compared to what is happening now. But on the other hand, there are far more beings in the future. So this raises lots of complicated questions, but those are empirical questions and like not the philosophical question. I mean, it has to be distinguished between those two different levels.
Yeah, that makes sense. So again, it's a practical concern about our capacity to have an impact rather than a philosophical question about the value. And on the future beings thing, it's clear that you don't think we should apply a sort of discounting that says the value of future suffering is any different from the value of today's suffering. Is it valid to discount based on the probability of that being existing? So if we're uncertain about whether they'll exist, is that a fair reason to discount?
Well, yeah, I would say so, right? I mean, if a being doesn't exist, then of course they don't need to be taken into account. But I mean, I suppose one would have to again go into the expected value framework, and in expectation, there are arguably far more future beings than are alive now. Even if you assign only a small probability to like scenarios where humanity expands into space or something like that, or has advanced technology, which allows the creation of large numbers of beings, even a small probability of such large futures would be sufficient to make the case that in expectation there are more beings, far more beings in the distant future than are alive right now. In fact, even if the world just continues to exist the way it is now, if it exists for a long time, then that would also mean that there are far more beings in the future than are alive right now.
Yeah, just because of the duration. Yeah, thank you. Well, that's been fascinating. Can I just drag you back for a moment to one of the other things I love about your book is that you're already sort of assuming we have a sentiocentric stance, and one of the problems we've still got to break through is that anthropocentric one. And you mentioned going vegetarian when you were 17, 18. What was that transition like for you at the time, socially and family-wise? And have you moved on to veganism since? I mean, it took me sort of 20 years to go from one to the other, but what have those transitions been like for you socially? And is there an indication there about, because you're trying to fight, if you like, the next wave of social norm battles, but that one is central for many of us.
It hasn't been so difficult socially. Not necessarily super easy either, but it wasn't too bad. And I did move on to become vegan a few years later.
Let's move on to the final question about how we can make a better future, or in this context, avoid some deeply terrible futures. And I guess my opening question is, if we're deeply concerned with suffering and we center trying to avoid suffering as an imperative, for some people, that leads them to an interesting intersection between S risks of the risks of suffering and X risks, the risks of extinction. And it leads some people to a conclusion that, really the only way of guaranteeing an end to suffering is to bring an end to sentient existence writ large in ideas like antinatalism and so on. And interestingly, some people apply that to humanity because they have this weird idea that nature without humanity is a wonderful sort of Garden of Eden place devoid of suffering, which I think is deeply bizarre. But some people will take that next step and say, well, really the ideal outcome is the eradication of all sentient beings, and then there will be no suffering, and then there'll be no S risks. What's your thought about that sort of branch of philosophy and its response to the challenge you've laid out?
Yeah, I mean, I would, while I can sort of on some level understand where this is coming from, since I subscribe to suffering-focused ethics, I don't necessarily find that a very helpful approach to have. It's important to keep in mind that we don't exist in a vacuum, and there are lots of people that don't share our views. And, if we want to get something done and not just, piss everyone off, then, you need to take that into account. And to go ahead and say that humanity shouldn't exist is not necessarily a very helpful strategy, in my opinion. I don't think this is going to achieve very much, especially since it's not true that this is the only way to prevent S risks, right? I mean, I think that on the margin, there are many other things that are far more strategically effective and reasonable to look at than this sort of most nuclear option of all. Which, as I'm saying, is like if one were to seriously pursue that, it would just trigger an enormous backlash, and that's actually quite toxic and counterproductive to the goal of reducing suffering, of preventing S risks. So I wouldn't recommend that strategy at all.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a sort of practical strategic thing in there, but there's also just a view that we can actually come up with a much better, more positive answer, I guess, rather than sort of giving up and just taking everything to zero instead. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, this argument that humanity going extinct would be better, like that, I mean, at least in some versions, it requires like having a pure suffering-focused view, that only suffering matters. And I mean, there is a spectrum of views which ranges from like believing that suffering is just one thing among many, to believing that suffering should be our highest priority, to believing that only suffering matters. So there's like a spectrum of views in between there, and that's worth keeping in mind. And I would say that I personally, like, while I do subscribe to suffering-focused ethics, and this is my main focus area, I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say that like categorically only suffering matters and everything else is total nonsense. I think it's important to maintain a degree of humility and pluralism about values, and not fall into some sort of fanaticism or extremism about one specific thing.
Yeah, makes sense. There's some pluralism in there too. Yeah. So if you've hinted at this already, but it might be a good time to lay out some of the main types of S risk, to put some, more detail around these things so people can actually understand what it is you're concerned about and how we might be able to mitigate those things. And if, in a way, there's a sort of portfolio of different types of S risks, some of which are more near-term and maybe more familiar and easier to identify with. And then there's some stuff that might seem a little bit more outlandish and sci-fi and maybe lower probability as well. So how would you best sort of summarize the types of S risks that you think we need to be taking seriously?
Yeah, this can be a quite tricky issue, because in truth, there is a wide range of scenarios, and there is a great degree of uncertainty about the future, because we just don't quite know what happens. And so it can be quite tricky to give a specific example, because then any specific example that you give might sound quite speculative or even absurd to some people. And so that's risky, because like maybe the most worrisome risks are those that we don't even know about, like the unknowns or unknown unknowns. But of course, there are some things that one could say. There's the distinction between incidental and agential S risks. So incidental S risks are something like factory farming, where suffering is sort of created as a byproduct, so to speak, of some economic process, and like something like this could simply happen on a much larger scale in the future. Then there's another class called agential S risks, which is even more disturbing in a way, where there are malevolent actors that would deliberately cause harm out of sheer sadism or spite or vindictiveness or anything, things of the sort.
And we know these people exist, so...
Yes. I mean, one would hope that these dynamics can be kept in check in the future, but this is a different class of worst-case outcomes that is worth keeping in mind too. There's a third class, which is called natural S risks, which would be, I mean, this is maybe less important overall, but it's for instance, if the universe is already populated, if life is common in the universe, wild animal suffering on other planets, that would also technically count as an S-risk, because there is already a large amount of suffering out there. Even though, I mean, as far as we can tell, the universe appears to be empty. So this doesn't seem a particularly likely one. But this maybe gives you an overview of the range of scenarios that is conceivable. If you want something more concrete, I don't know, maybe you can watch episodes of Black Mirror or something like that. They have some ideas.
It's not a bad starting point. And I think that's quite a useful way of people to engage in this topic. If they find the stuff to do with space or the far future or sentient AI, just doesn't grab them, doesn't engage them, that's fine, right? There are nearer to our intuitions things that can help them plug in, and whether that's episodes of Black Mirror, whether it's imagining totalitarian state or empire locks in, we can use, and as you said already, industrial farming, right? We've got some examples close to home that at least give an indication of the types of things we're concerned about here. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I was trying to strike that balance in my book of discussing the more speculative possibilities, while also making clear that this is not something that you need to accept in order for S-risks to be something that's worth being concerned about.
Thank you. And I think it fits into, it would be good to talk about, okay, what are we going to do about it? What's your suggestion for how we can mitigate these risks? But to cue that up, I think part of the challenge here, strategically and socially, is I think a challenge that you probably face that's related to issues that come through in the AI risk space and thinking about existential risks, and sometimes even more broadly in, I guess, feels like effective altruism too, where there's a sense sometimes from outside of those movements. My sense as an amateur is that most of those movements are generally driven by people with a deep, serious compassion for sentient beings and the future paths of the world, and want to genuinely try and do the right thing. That's my sense. There are always bad actors, right, in any movement, and there are always problems and there are always issues. But the center of gravity feels to it deeply ethical and well-intended and morally and epistemically serious to me in most of those places. But the perspective from the outside is sometimes of sort of Elon Musk style transhumanist tech bro who, rather than a sort of really broad compassion for everybody else, is just about taking him and his elite of mates off to do space exploration. And so there's this sense from outside that the sci-fi aspects of it and the longer term aspects of it feed into this vibe about people who are working in those spaces. And that, however well founded those challenges are, it feels like that's part of the strategic challenge you've got here of trying to make change happen. What do you think is the best way of, one, do you think some of those challenges are fair, or what's the best way of countering them and mitigating them and explaining to a broader variety of humanity what you're really trying to do here?
Yeah. It can be very tricky to talk about those issues and avoid this perception of it being crazy or absurd or sci-fi or something of the sort. I have been trying to avoid that as much as I can in the book, as I mentioned. I think you're right to say that some of those things are not entirely wrong. With Elon Musk's project, one can wonder why exactly is it so important for him to go to Mars? I don't really think that this has been entirely thought through, other than it seems kind of cool, but is it an important thing to do actually?
Yeah, I was a teenage boy once, but I like to think I've moved on from that. Some extremely rich, powerful people don't seem to have got out of that mindset yet.
Yeah, and that sort of foundation of what actually matters or who matters should sort of be thought about first before you're spending many, many billions of dollars on going to Mars. But okay, let's maybe not get too much into the Musk thing.
So let's move on from that into, what's your prescription? What are your suggestions for how we address these things? So your point is these are potentially very serious. Not enough people or institutions are taking them seriously. And given their potentially worst case outcomes, we really should. So how do we go from here to a position where, this becomes something that humanity and hopefully the powerful AI we're allied with, are actually taking seriously and doing something about?
Yeah. This, I guess, is the $1 million question, right? What can we do about it? And I mean, the first thing I would say is that it's again worth keeping in mind our level of uncertainty about this, about how S-risks will come about and what we can do about this. And so, in a way, perhaps the answer to what we should do about it is that we should do more research to figure out what to do about S-risks, right? So that ideally, future people who want to reduce S-risks will be in a better position to do that. So like at the Center for Reducing Suffering, we're thinking about it in terms of capacity building, like building the capacity over the long term for future decision makers to be able to prevent S-risks. And in addition to research that also entails community building, getting more people involved and thinking about these topics and contributing to them, so that we will in the future be better able to prevent S-risks. Now, I think that probably would be my answer to the question, but I do understand that those higher level abstract, more meta interventions, that it might feel a bit unsatisfactory perhaps to some people. So there are also some more concrete interventions that I'm exploring in my book, and it entails expanding the moral circle, like spreading concern for the suffering of all sentient beings. It entails things like trying to improve our political system, which you've already mentioned earlier. I would also maybe give a reference to Magnus Winding's book on reasoned politics, where he explores that particular step and its contribution to S-risk reduction in much more detail.
Yeah, that's a great read.
Yeah, then another thing is there are some people specifically at the Center on Long-Term Risk that are working on more specific interventions to address S-risks in the context of AI in particular. They also have a research agenda. It aims to prevent S-risky scenarios involving conflicts between AIs. Like some people might find this speculative, but I nevertheless think that this is one possible approach to S-risks. So if you're interested in that, you can Google the research agenda of the Center on Long-Term Risk. Yeah, I mean, there is, of course, a lot to be said about the pros and cons of all those different interventions. I think neither of them is necessarily the answer to everything. And as I was saying, it's important to maintain a large degree of humility about this and not to fall into the trap of thinking too early that we quite know what to do about S-risks, because I would argue that we don't fully have the answer to that yet. And that's perhaps why the most important thing is research and capacity building.
Yeah, that humility leads you to put research as your number one. Yeah. And the other thing that I think I found encouraging in reading through the types of interventions and the types of changes we can make is that many of the suggestions you were making, that was, as you said, talking about moral scope expansion, or it was talking about changes to our institutions or changes to our politics to defend democracy and to extend democracy to become a sort of sentiocracy where non-human sentients get some form of representation, and that the democracy is improved such that it's more proportional representation rather than first past the post or presidential, those types of things. And you read through those suggestions you're making, and I'm thinking, these are all things that have immediate near-term benefits, even for people who haven't gone on the S-risk journey as well. How rich is the overlap between the things you propose we should do to deal with S-risks and more immediate, more familiar challenges? Is that a lucky overlap, or is that you just being clever and politically positioning the interventions that will resonate with people who, have more immediate concerns?
No, I mean, maybe it is a little bit of both. I mean, I think there can be overlap, and that overlap is not just some spurious coincidence. I mean, maybe there are just things that just make the world broadly better from many perspectives. Like, I mean, I suppose having a more functional political system is one example of that. It's not surprising that this is positive from many perspectives, like both from a more near-termist perspective and from an asterisk-focused perspective. It's not so surprising that it's positive across many different futures. Now, I mean, you could spin that argument to sort of say that, like, because it's positive for everyone, maybe it's not so neglected, and maybe it's not so targeted at reducing asterisks. That's an argument that one can make, that I'm also sometimes sympathetic towards. It's maybe true that, you know, the idea of trying to improve politics isn't perhaps entirely novel. On the other hand, there's also the point that you've made that we, of course, need to come up with something that is of interest to more than just like a small circle or handful of people that are talking and thinking about asterisks. Because if you want to gain traction in the real world, you know, it has to be something that has somewhat broader appeal. So there's a trade-off between those two different considerations, which can be quite interesting.
Yeah, I agree. It makes sense. And I think you could take those sorts of considerations to the next step and say, well, actually, we can forget about asterisks completely. What we just need to do is work on more immediate concerns, because we know they'll help with the asterisks anyway. And I think that would be a mistake. You'd see that as a mistake.
I think that would be taking it too far, because it's still often quite unclear how exactly those more immediate things, what exactly the impact on asterisks would be. And you sort of have to think that through, right? Before you're jumping to the conclusion that, like, oh, what I wanted to do anyway just so happens to also be great from an asterisk perspective. Awesome. Well, often it's not that simple in most cases, right? So,
agree. And that leads you back to the humility point you made earlier on. There's so much uncertainty here. That's why you really need to do the research and think about the outliers, the unknowns, the unintended consequences, and the things you might just miss if you just sort of focus on the near term. Yeah.
And it might also be that some things are positive from an asterisk perspective, but still not the most important or most effective use of marginal resources. So that's also another thing to keep in mind.
I'm interested in your view about how much, I guess, you know, worldviews play a role in that, because you've already talked very clearly about moral scope expansion and, you know, broadening our moral circle. And in a way, that's you know, one half of what I'm trying to propose with this sentientism idea, is to say, look, we need to have a sentiocentric moral scope, and we need to push to that, regardless of species or even substrate or so on and so forth. And obviously, the other half of sentientism is this naturalistic grounding for understanding reality, which plays into your ideas about being aware of encountering our biases and doing, you know, empirically grounded research to try and improve our understanding of reality as well. And in a way, that's maybe naively why I've been trying to suggest that promoting this sentientism worldview might be, even in the face of deep moral uncertainty and epistemological uncertainty, a sort of broadly robust intervention that is by no means sufficient, but at least it seems like a sort of safe, solid platform that, if we could get more of humanity to agree to, might help us move forward. I don't know if you have any thoughts about, you know, worldviews, because I think sometimes my stance can come across as quite naive. Like, we just need to persuade everyone to agree with evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings, and all the world's problems will be solved. Other people are like, look, I'm not so interested in worldviews. It's about specific policies or interventions or hard-edged technical stuff we've got to do. What role do you think worldviews can or should play in this shift?
I mean, I think you're not wrong about this approach, and I do think that it's a good approach. So, I mean, I think we're broadly on the same page about this idea of using evidence and reason to help all sentient beings. I mean, of course, as you're saying, people tend to have quite different preferences about how much they like the more abstract side of things, or the more philosophical side, or maybe the more practical side. So there's a balance to be struck there, and different angles to explore. What I'm doing is, like, perhaps on a fairly similar level of abstraction as what you're doing, in that it tends to focus mostly on the worldview side of things, by exploring the concept of asterisks, but then also going into practical interventions, because I think that there is certainly a risk of perhaps going too much in the direction of, you know, people just discussing something on the internet with nothing ever happening in the real world, which is, of course, ultimately the goal of all this is to change something in the real world. And that's always important to keep in mind too.
Yeah, that's the ultimate point. Yeah, keep that goal in mind. Well, it's been fascinating to talk to you. Thank you. I really enjoyed the book. It's a compelling read. And I think it does that job brilliantly of grounding a topic, but also stretching people's intuition so that they open their minds, hopefully, to a broader set of deep, potentially worst case problems we need to mitigate and head off. So thank you for that. Is there anything else you wanted to add into the conversation? We've sort of answered what's real, what matters, who matters, and how to avoid a terrible future. But anything else you'd like to add in? And also, how can people best follow you, support your work at CRS, read the book?
Sure. I think so. I don't so much have like a personal platform or so, but people can find my work and that of my colleagues on the website of the Center for Reducing Suffering. If you just Google Center for Reducing Suffering, you can download my book. It's for freely available, both as a PDF and actually also as an audiobook. You can also find the books by my colleague Magnus Winding, which are called Suffering-Focused Ethics and Reasoned Politics. And I would highly recommend those books, of course, along with many other articles and publications on our website. And there's also a newsletter to subscribe to if you want to stay informed. So my main recommendation, if you're interested in exploring those topics further, would be to go to the website of the Center for Reducing Suffering.
That's great. Thank you. I'll include the links in the show notes, of course, so people can click through and sign up. Well, thank you again. It's been such a pleasure to have you as a guest on Sentientism. Please stay in touch, and thank you for all your work with CRS too.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's been a great conversation.